Hello and welcome to the history of movie theaters in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul for 1884 to 1919. (1883). The Grand Opera House in St. Paul opens on April 2nd. 1887. The People's Theater in Minneapolis opens on October 31st. The Hennepin Theater in Minneapolis becomes the Harris Theater. The Lyceum in Minneapolis is opened by this time. 1890. The People's Theater in Minneapolis is renamed the Bijou Opera House. The Grand Opera House in St. Paul opens. 1894. The Metropolitan Theater opens in St. Paul. 1898. The People's Theater in Minneapolis becomes the Metropolitan Theater, showing its first movies. The Wonderland Theater in Minneapolis opens. 1899. The Star Theater in Minneapolis reopens on November 27th. 1903. The Unique Theater in St. Paul opens. 1904. The Orpheum Theater in Minneapolis opens on October 22nd. 1904. The Unique Theater in Minneapolis opens on October 31st. 1905. The Minneapolis Auditorium Theater in Minneapolis opens. 1906. The Orpheum Theater in St. Paul opens. 1908. The Miles Theater in Minneapolis opens on December 28th. The Criterion Theater in Minneapolis opens. 1909. The Lyric Theater in Minneapolis opens. 1909. The Crystal Theater opens on August 28th. The Gaiety Theater in Minneapolis opens on November 18th. The Rosebud Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Princess Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Lyceum Theater at 718 Hennepin in Minneapolis closes. 1910. The Schubert Theater in Minneapolis opens on August 29. The Schubert Theater in St. Paul opens. These theaters also opened in 1910. '11. 1911. The Grand Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Empress Theater in St. Paul opens. These theaters opened in 1911. The Crystal Theater in St. Paul becomes the Colonial and closes shortly after. 1912. The American Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Grand Opera House in Minneapolis has been rebuilt. The Starland Theater in St. Paul opens. These theaters also opened in 1912. 1913. The Cozy Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Lagoon Theater in Minneapolis opens. It later became the Uptown Theater in 1929. The Faust Theater in St. Paul opens. (1914). The Sachs Theater in Minneapolis opens on September 6. The Palace Theater in Minneapolis opens on October 5. The Sachs Theater in Minneapolis becomes the Strand Theater on November 18. The Central Avenue Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Franklin Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Gem Theater in New Richmond, Wisconsin opens. The Miles Theater in Minneapolis closes for rebuilding. The Grand Opera House in Minneapolis closes. The Grand Opera House in St. Paul closes. 1915. The Old Miles Theater in Minneapolis is reopened as Garrick on January 17 after a complete rebuilding. The New Garden Theater in Minneapolis opened or placed its first ad on November 9. The Nokomis Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Victoria Theater in St. Paul opens. These theaters also opened in 1915. (1916). The Rialto Theater in Minneapolis opens on April 22nd. The Astor Theater in Minneapolis opens on May 28th. The Pantages Theater in Minneapolis opens on October 22nd. The Palace Theater in St. Paul opens. These theaters also opened in 1916. The Empress Theater in St. Paul closes. (1917). The Brandt Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Cedar Photo Plays in Minneapolis opens. The Old Empress Theater in St. Paul reopens as the New Liberty Theater. (1918). The New Liberty Theater in St. Paul is renamed Liberty. The Old Grand Opera House in St. Paul reopens as the Garrick Theater. (1919). The Jewel Theater in Minneapolis opens. The Star Theater in St. Paul closes. Thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe.